What's up, guys and gals? This is Christopher Sheffield of Chef Shoots Indie and Persephone Productions. This video is about dynamic lighting. Now, I do already have an older video about dynamic lighting where I get into the basics of it, dynamic lighting versus dramatic lighting, and I do give you a very basic example of what that looks like. If you haven't checked that video out, I would go back and watch it just so you have sort of a base sense of familiarity before we move forward, and then hop back over to this one. For those that have seen that video, I will quickly review. Dynamic lighting is not a term that I created, but I do have a very specific definition for what I think that falls into. So in my mind, dynamic lighting is when you mix multiple formats of lighting in the same frame. So that could be harsh light and soft light, that could be two different color temperatures, that could be two different textures of light, or that could be all of that being used in the same frame. So for this video, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna light a couple different scenes around my apartment and try to give you guys an example of dynamic lighting in each one of those in what I hope will be a different way. My apartment is not huge, so we'll be working in confined spaces, which will be good for a lot of you independent filmmakers who are used to working with limited resources. The first piece of advice that I'm gonna give all of you about lighting in general is that you need to control the light in the room. So that means turning off all the lights to start with. That means turning off any lights in the adjacent rooms that might be coming in through windows or doorways. That means blocking out all of the windows that you don't want to play in the scene, not allowing there to be a ton of fill light in the room. Controlling the light essentially means try to start at the closest to zero that you can so that you can control every element of that light for two reasons. Number one, you want to be able to use the exposure settings in your camera that you want to use, not be dictated by how bright the lights are outside or how bright the kitchen lights are, etc. You want to be able to control as much of this image as possible. And number two, when you think about lighting, think about it this way. Every light that you introduce into a scene is a statement. You're trying to say something about that scene, about that moment, about that character, about that time of day. You're telling the audience something with every piece of light that you introduce. So if there is like a rogue element, a light in the scene that you can't turn off, or a light that is coming into the frame that you did not introduce, that's adding information for your audience that doesn't need to be there. So the number one thing you want to do in any given on-camera situation is control the light in the room. All right, let's hop into the first example. Okay, so for the first scene, we've got a character sitting at a computer. So right away, I'm gonna want my key light to reflect the circumstances in the scene, which means I want my key light to feel like it's coming off of the computer screen. Now, rather than just turn the computer screen on and get a light that, I can't control the color of that light, I can't control the intensity. So what I'm gonna do is introduce a super heavily diffused key light so it feels like a nice, soft light that's coming off of the computer monitor. So in its most basic form, this one light kind of does the trick. We get the idea that she is at a computer. We understand that that's where the light is coming from. So the key light is doing its job. Now, the next thing that I want to do to make this film more dynamic is I want to be able to see the rest of the room, but in a way that makes it make sense for your eyes. So rather than just putting a random light back there, I'm going to give it a practical source. And I'm going to use that practical source to introduce our first element of dynamic lighting, which is going to be a different color temperature. Okay, so what we have here is this really cool IKEA practical light that I put in the background. I have it heavily diffused because it was way brighter than my key light, so there's a lot of diffusion on the inside of that thing trying to keep that shine down. The cool thing about this light is that it adds two different color tones. A 27K bulb comes through a little bit more yellow, a little bit more straw through that top part, and then the bottom half has a blue tint to it, so right away we have kind of a nice color effect in the background behind her. Now, since that light exists, I now have the opportunity to make this frame a little bit more dynamic. So what I'm going to do is place another panel behind her head and have it set at something a little less yellow at 32K, but close enough that the audience will put it together with their eyes and assume that the light that is now both rimming the chair and her hair to kind of bring her into the scene a little bit more and put the whole thing together, it feels now like it's coming from the lamp in the background. Okay, so even now with just 3 lights on, we already have a dynamic image. We have soft light on her face, we have a harsh light that's on the top of her head and rimming her shoulders, and we have a practical light in the background that gives us a little bit more color but also a little bit of texture. Now we're actually going to take this a step further. Since we do have elements in the background that can be lit up, there's no reason why they shouldn't be. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is introduce the computer and the keyboard in the background as 2 more sources of dynamic light in the scene. Now that those lights are on, we went from a very basic image to a full room. Now we get the full sense of the room. We have a little bit of interesting information in the background as well as the foreground. We can see the art in the room now, we can see the contours of the room a little bit more, and we're doing that by mixing a bunch of different lighting formats. Now, the very last thing that I'm going to add as a bonus is actually another touch of color on the desk behind her. This gives us the sense that there's maybe a neon light somewhere nearby. It could be considered spill from that lamp with a little bit of blue on the lamp. The idea is just to make it feel a little more trendy, a little more interesting to look at for the short amount of time that it's going to be on camera. In a word, it makes this whole image feel more dynamic. Okay, before we get too far into this, I want to give you guys a quick piece of advice. It doesn't apply 100% of the time, but I think it's very important to keep in mind. When you are lighting a scene cinematically, typically speaking, you're going to get your best results when your key light is on a separate trajectory from your camera. The chief reason for that is that you want the shadows and the contours and the texture of whatever you're filming to fall on camera's side. That's the most interesting part. Where you go from there is you introduce other lights around your subject to highlight the other elements in the scene. Again, that applies to what I would say is about 90% of your setups. You're going to find that the key light on the far side of camera, on the far side of your actor's blocking trajectory, is going to give you the most cinematic results. Not 100% of the time. I have definitely found myself filming next to windows where the key light was coming through the same angle of the camera. It still looked fantastic. Some things that you shoot don't call for a super heavy cinematic look. Sometimes you have to introduce a lot of fill light to make things feel light and airy and pretty. So again, not 100% of the time, but if you are looking for like an edgy, cinematic, emotional, evocative kind of image, you're gonna wanna put the key light on the far side of your camera's trajectory. All right, let's hop back into it. Okay, so since the previous image was nighttime, for this one I wanted to go for something a little different. I wanted to show you kind of a daytime look. So naturally, we're gonna start with a completely dark room, and then we're gonna add our key light. In this case, I want the key light to be a very direct, very harsh sunlight spill, make it feel like it's coming through a window in the early morning, let it be kind of splashy on certain surfaces of the room, but I don't want that harsh light on her face. Now, if you wanted to go for a minimalist look, this might do the trick. But the next thing that I'm gonna do is to try to make that sunlight feel a little more interesting, a little less like it's coming from a source of light and make it really feel like it's coming through a window. The way I do that is I'm gonna take what some people call a cookie, which is basically just like a black card with slats cut in it to create a shape. I did a very similar thing on my previous dynamic lighting video. It was a little bit rough around the edges there, so this is a little bit more clean. And what I'm gonna do here is use it to create lines in our key light. So again, it feels organic. It feels like it's spilling through a window that's gonna have window shades. So as you can see, that cut down on a lot of the key light, but it also makes the spill more interesting. Now there are sections that your eyes can go to instead of the whole room being lit. Okay, so that's two elements to our lighting, but now with less light in the room, we have less fill. So now it's even harder for us to see our actress. So what I'm gonna do is introduce a softbox fill up in the corner and try to make it feel like it's coming from the same window. All right, so what we do there is now we have a very similar look to what we started with, except it's not quite as splashy. The light is nice and soft on her face. Her cheeks are rimmed. We can see her eyes. We can see the expressions that she has, what she's going through in the scene, but it also still retains that organic sunlight feel. So once again, we've mixed formats of lighting. You could call this a finished image. You could do the scene from here. I'm gonna take it one step further and I'm gonna add a different color temperature in there. Since we are in a kitchen, there are things like stove lights that we can introduce. So what I'm gonna do is put another panel behind the fridge and add a little bit of 32K tungsten warm light to the scene. And what that's gonna do is it's gonna warm the scene up a little bit. It's also gonna give us a little bit more separation between the sunlight in the room. A tiny bit of that light on her on the edge of her face. We can see a little bit on the wall back there behind her. It's creating a nice interesting texture there. The whole thing just creates an image that's a little more pleasing to look at, a little more interesting, a little more dynamic. Okay, so for our final scene, once again, we're gonna start with a completely black room. If you can see outside the bedroom window, there's a little bit of light that's spilling from the outside that I wasn't able to control, but it's not bright enough that it's really gonna impact our image, so I thought it was fine to just leave it how it was, instead of worrying about trying to black out the neighbor's lights. So once again, we're gonna start with our key light. In this example, our key light is a very minimal softbox. The idea is that it's supposed to feel like some sort of small reading lamp in her room that gives her a little bit of light to see by, but not enough that it's blasting out the entire room. So we're still able to have a lot of contrast in our image. So again, if you want it to be super minimal, here's your key light, here's your scene. This light is definitely dramatic, but it's not exactly dynamic. So we're gonna make it a little bit more dynamic. So if you look at the rest of the room, there's not a lot of color in this image. It's sort of a muted color palette. So what I wanna do is bring some really bright dynamic color in the rooms. So I'm gonna make use of the practical lamp that's in the back in the corner, and I'm actually gonna add a super diffused red bulb to that. All right, so right away the room is looking a little more interesting. There's a little more going on here. Two different colors of light, two different textures of light. So of course, the next thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna separate her from the background a little more by complementing the light in the back. I'm gonna take a panel, I'm gonna gel the color to match the light in the back, and then I'm gonna point that at the back of her head. So now we have a little bit of red spill that lands on her hair, on her shoulders, on the books. Again, it just really pulls her into the room. It ties all the elements together. Even though that light didn't actually reach her, we make it feel like it reaches her and it makes sense visually for the audience. Makes a much more interesting frame. So if you really wanted to make this feel dramatic, you can leave this one how it is. If you wanted to soften the image a little bit, which I do, I'm gonna bring in a little bit more fill light on her, and I'm actually gonna add an eye light, which is a light that you typically keep close to the lens or close to the actor's eye line. And what it does is it kind of brings their eyes out of the shadow. So if they have an emotion, even from a distance, we're able to really catch what's going on in their head. So this is what the eye light added. And of course, I want to make sure that my eye light matches my key light so that it feels like a nice continuous light, like it's all coming from the same source. So it's very easy for the audience's brain to put it all together into one image. We have a soft light in the front, we have a harsh light on her back, we have a practical in the background, different textures of shadow back there. But I'm gonna go ahead and take it one step further, and I'm gonna add more color to this frame. Since we have established that she's the type of person who would have a colorful practical lamp, we can go ahead and assume that there's other colorful practical lamps in the room. So what I'm gonna do is add a second color to splash on the walls, and again, pick up the monotone room and make it more interesting to look at. For some people, that might be a little too splashy, a little too bubblegum. For others, that might be exactly what they wanted to see. Maybe the character isn't quite so moody, maybe the moment isn't quite so dark, maybe it's a little more relaxing and you wanna make the room feel like it has a vibe to it. So again, this is a very simple image, but it's using multiple styles of lighting all in the same frame to create a more dynamic and interesting image to look at. All right, so those are a couple examples of what I would consider to be dynamic lighting. I will say again, as I always do on these videos, that this is art, this is very subjective. If you guys or gals do not agree with me, please tell me in the comments. I'd love to talk to you about it. I'd love to keep talking about film when I'm out on set, when I'm on the job, when I'm shooting a film. I always strive to keep the frame dynamic. So obviously it's something that I'm very passionate about, visually speaking, so I could talk about it forever. So if you guys have any questions, comments, concerns, your own opinions, you want to talk about your favorite lighting setups, your favorite types of lights to use, that sort of thing, by all means, stick them in the comments. I would love to chat with you.